Hi Gorsey Bank, it's Mrs Thompson here, ready to read you a little bit of a story like lots of the other teachers have done. My choice of book is called Beetle Boy. It's a mystery thriller, so it's probably a little bit more suited to years 5 and 6. And it's one of my favourites. So, Chapter 1, The Mysterious Disappearance of Bartholomew Cuttle. Dr. Bartholomew Cuttle wasn't the kind of man who mysteriously disappeared. He was the kind of man who read enormous old books at the dinner table and got fried eggs stuck in his beard. He was the kind of man who always lost his keys and never took an umbrella on rainy days. He was the kind of dad who might be 5 minutes late picking you up from school, but he always came. More than anything else, Darcus knew his dad was not the kind of father who would abandon his 13-year-old son. The police report stated that the 27th of September had been an unremarkable Tuesday. Dr. Bartholomew Cuttle, a 48-year-old widower, had taken his son Darcus Cuttle to school and had gone on to the Natural History Museum, where he was the Director of Science. He'd greeted his secretary, Margaret, at 9:30, spent a morning in meetings discussing museum business, and he'd eaten lunch at 1 o'clock with an ex-colleague, Professor Andrew Appleyard. In the afternoon, he'd gone down to the collection vaults, as he frequently would, via the coffee machine, where he'd filled up his cup. He'd exchanged pleasantries with Eddie, the security guard on duty that day, walked down the corridor to the vaults, and locked himself in one of the entomology rooms. That evening, when his father didn't come home, Darcus alerted the neighbours and called the police. When the police arrived at the museum, the room Dr. Cuttle had entered was locked from the inside. Fearing he may have suffered a heart attack or had an accident, they produced a steel battering ram and smashed the door open. The room was empty. A stone-cold cup of coffee sat with some papers on the table beside a microscope. Several specimen drawers were open, but there was no sign of Dr. Bartholomew Cuttle. He had vanished. The vault had no windows or doors other than the ones he had entered by. It was a sealed chamber with controlled atmosphere. The puzzle of the disappearing scientist made the front page of the newspapers. The unsolvable mystery drove journalists crazy, and not one of them could explain how Dr. Cuttle had got out of the vault. "Scientist disappears!" Headlines screamed. "Police are foxed!" Newspapers cried. "Orphan boy placed in care," they reported. "Hunt is on for the only living relative, famous archaeologist Maximilian Cuttle." And the next day, "Archaeologist lost in Sinai Desert. Boy alone," they wailed. Outside the foster home, journalists stopped Darcus in the street, taking pictures and shouting questions. "Darcus, have you heard from your dad? Darcus, is your father on the run? Darcus, is your dad dead?" 5 years earlier, when his mother died, Darcus had retreated inside himself. He stopped playing out with his friends or inviting anyone over. His mum, Esme Cuttle, had been taken away suddenly by pneumonia. The shock was terrible. His dad was overcome with grief. Some days, blue days, Darcus called them, his father lay in bed and stared at the wall, unable to speak, tears rolling down his cheeks. On the bleakest blue days, Darcus would bring tea and biscuits and sit beside his dad, reading. It was double hard losing Mum and Dad being so sad all the time. Darcus had to learn to take care of himself. At school, he got on with everyone, but he didn't have any close friends. He kept himself to himself. The other children wouldn't understand, and he wasn't sure he could explain it. The only thing that mattered was taking care of Dad and helping him get happy again. Finally, 4 years after Mum's death, the blue days got fewer and further apart, and Darcus watched with joy as his father awoke from his long sleep of sadness. He became a proper dad again, playing football on Sundays, smiling at Darcus over the breakfast table and teasing him about his unruly hair. No, Darcus was sure his dad wasn't suicidal or on the run or living a double life. Something else had happened in that vault, and that made him sick to the stomach with fear, because he couldn't think what that something else could possibly be. So when they asked their stupid questions, he jammed his hands in his pockets, scowled at the notebooks and refused to answer. "Boy with broken heart! Stop speaking!" the papers told the world. When Darcus's uncle, Professor Maximilian Cuttle, was finally tracked down in Egypt, he flew straight back to London to look after his nephew. The papers, unable to solve the mystery of the disappearing scientists or make up any news stories about Darcus, lost interest and left him alone. Uncle Max brought Darcus home to his flat above Mother Earth, a health food shop in a parade of shops between Camden Town and Regent's Park. "I have to warn you, my boy," Uncle Max said as they climbed the stairs. "I've always lived on my own. Travel a lot, you see. Never much liked England. It's all that blasted rain, dreary, and not much fun on a dig. I'll tell you, I'd rather be in the Sinai Desert riding a camel." He paused to catch his breath. "Anyway, long and short, not much good with guests. I like 'em, just not sure what to do with 'em. Same goes for children." Darcus followed his uncle silently through the front door, enjoying listening to a voice so similar to his father. "Kitchen." Uncle Max first pointed to a bright orange room on his left, and then up some stairs to his right. "Living room." As they passed the living room, Darcus stared at the series of long-faced wooden masks hanging on the midnight blue walls, and they stared back at him. Climbing another flight of stairs to the second floor, they arrived outside Uncle Max's bedroom and a large pink bathroom. "Because I work abroad most of the year, the university won't give me an office, so this is my office as well as my home," Uncle Max said as they climbed a third flight of stairs into the loft. "And up until now, the room you'll be sleeping in, it's been my, it's been my filing cabinet." When they reached the low-ceilinged landing of the third floor, Uncle Max leant against the wall and made a show of being tired. Pulling a handkerchief from his shirt pocket, he nudged up his safari hat with the swollen knuckles of his right hand and mopped his tanned, leathery forehead. He grimaced. "Whatever you do, don't get old, lad. Lord only knows how I'll make it back down again. You might have to carry me." He chuckled heartily to show he was joking, but when Darcus failed to join in, he smiled sadly and shook his head. "You might look like your mother, but you're Barty through and through. Esme would always laugh at my jokes, especially the unfunny ones." Darcus tried to be polite and smile, but it came out like a grimace. Conscious of Uncle Max studying him, he hugged his oversized green jumper to his body and looked down to see his scruffy jeans were torn at the knee. Because of his dark skin, hair and coal-black eyes, people said that he had his mother's Spanish looks. But when he thought of Mum, it was her wide smile that filled his head. His mouth was shaped like hers, but when he realised his smile made his dad sad, he stopped doing it. "What happened to your hair?" "They shaved it off at the foster home." Darcus rubbed his hand over his stubble. He didn't want to tell his uncle about the bully who had shaved a strip into his hair on the first night in that unfamiliar house. "There were nits," he muttered. "I see. Sensible precaution, I suppose." Uncle Max frowned, returning his handkerchief to his pocket. "Rightio." He pointed to the door in front of him. "That's the toilet." Then he walked along the landing. "And this is your room." Uncle Max gave Darcus an unapologetic grin before pushing the door open. "Ta-da!" A piece of paper covered in scribbled notes floated into the hall and landed at Darcus's feet. The room was tiny. Piles of paper hid the floor, and boxes were stacked clumsily on top of one another. Objects wrapped in yellowing newspaper hung out of half-opened packages, and the air was thick with the aroma of mildew and dust. Darcus sneezed. "Gesundheit," said Uncle Max, reaching inside the doorway and switching on the light. Beyond the boxes was a wall of black filing cabinets. Several drawers were half open, with paper spewing out, and on the top rows of hardback atlases and loose-leafed maps slumped against one another. Darcus noticed a skylight in the roof, Its external pane was spread so thick with grime that it filled the room with shadows. "You must hate filing," he said. "Well, yes, I suppose it's been some years." Uncle Max coughed. "Come to think of it, I'm not sure when I last came up here. It might have been before you were born." Darkus smiled weakly, not wanting to appear rude. Pleased that his nephew was warming, Uncle Max picked up a book from an open box. "An intellectual history of cannibalism. I've been looking for that." He raised his eyebrows twice and dropped the book back down. A cloud of dust erupted from the box and broke over Darkus's face. Uncle Max laughed as Darkus frantically waved the dust away with one hand, sneezing, and then unable to resist the infectious nature of his uncle's roars, laughing. "The upshot, lad," said Uncle Max, offering Darkus a clean handkerchief from his back pocket, "is it needs work. However, if we put our backs into it, I'm certain we can make this a bedroom of sorts." Darkus put his suitcase down in the hall. "It'll be fine, Uncle Max. Thank you." "Of course it will." Uncle Max clapped Darkus on the back, knocking him forward. "It'll be a rum old place when we're done." He took off his safari hat, his hair springing up above his tanned scalp like a cloud of silver thoughts. "First, I suggest we move everything out into the hall, because there's some cleaning to be done before this room is fit for humans." Darkus got stuck in. He pushed up the sleeves of his green jumpers, exposing dark skinny arms, and dragged a heavy box across the room. As he hauled it through the doorway, he stumbled backwards, ripping the carton open to see a stack of folders marked Faber Project, and scattered what looked like human teeth on the floor. "I'm sorry, he stammered. The teeth of Nefertiti." Uncle Max knelt down, carefully gathering the teeth into his hand. "Let's put them somewhere safe, shall we?" "The actual teeth of Nefertiti?" Darkus asked, wide-eyed. "Are you serious?" "Deadly serious." Uncle Max nodded. "I discovered a tomb. People will tell you it's still lost, but I found it. These teeth," he held up his hand, "are plucked from the casket of the infamously beautiful Egyptian queen." "Did you pull them out of her skull?" Uncle Max shrugged. "Well, she wasn't using them." Darkus picked up a stray tooth. "Shouldn't they be in a museum?" "They would be in a museum, lad, if anyone had listened to me," Uncle Max said. "But no, they wouldn't hear of it. A junior archaeologist making such an important discovery, a mere boy. They said it was impossible, but they were wrong. Just because a person is young doesn't mean they don't have the curiosity, determination and grit to do what a grown-up can do, eh?" Uncle Max sniffed. "When they finally decide to find the thing, and they will, because I've told them where it is, old Nefertiti will be toothless, and these beauties prove categorically that I was there first." He carefully poured the teeth into an envelope. "The past always has a way of catching up with you, lad, even when you don't want it to." He folded down the flap and sealed it. "It was one of my first Egyptian excavations, you see. I was fresh meat, newly qualified, and didn't understand the rules of the game. Grown-up life can be awfully dull, Darkus. It's full of politics and compromise." Uncle Max rambled on about the trials and tribulations of being an archaeologist, and Darkus nodded or shook his head as they cleared, swept and dusted the room together. A brightly coloured Moroccan cloth was thrown over 4 boxes of books to make a table, and 3 empty containers were stacked one on top of the other to make shelves for clothes. Uncle Max climbed onto a stool and scrubbed the inside of the skylight with vinegar-soaked newspaper. As he reached up to open the window and clean the outside, Darkus saw something black sitting on the glass. A creature with 7 legs, or was it 6? And a horn. "Wait!" Darkus called out, but Uncle Max pulled the window towards him and the creature leapt into the air, zooming away. "What was that?" Darkus pointed, wanting to scramble up onto Uncle Max's chair and get a proper look. "What was what?" Uncle Max looked up, but whatever the beast was, it had gone. 6 legs meant an insect, didn't it? No animal had 7. Maybe it was a bat or a small bird or 2, but bats didn't have horns, and even 2 birds only had 4 legs, and it must have been an insect. but he'd never seen an insect that big before. "The sun is setting," Uncle Max said, his head out of the window. "It's not an Egyptian sunset, but I must admit the city has a beauty of its own." Darkus surveyed the tiny room. "Uncle Max?" "Yes, lad." "Where am I going to sleep?" Uncle Max popped his head back into the room. Darkus threw his hands out. "I don't think a bed will fit in here, and I don't have a spare one. And even if it would fit, which it wouldn't," Uncle Max nodded in agreement. "I suppose I could sleep on the floor or on the ceiling," said Uncle Max. "Right." Darkus scratched his head, unsure if Uncle Max was joking again. "In a hammock," Uncle Max said. "A hanging bed sort of a thing. Sailors and archaeologists use them all the time. They're very useful for avoiding the deadly sting of a fat-tailed scorpion. Not that there are any scorpions here, you understand. Well, not ones that are alive, any rate. So, how does a hammock sound?" "It sounds good." "Excellent, because I have a spare one of those." Uncle Max went out into the hall and returned with a blue bag. Inside was a yellow, sandy-coloured stretch of canvas gathered around two large copper hoops. "I thought we could hang it up over there." Uncle Max pointed to the roof space above the filing cabinets. Darkus nodded eagerly, and Uncle Max reached into the bag and pulled out two brass hooks and a mallet. "Run down to the living room, lad, and grab the sleeping bag. It's on the leather armchair, and bring up a cushion from the sofa." When Darkus came back upstairs, Uncle Max had hung the hammock. He eagerly clambered onto the cabinets and flopped into his new bed, which rocked gently from side to side. Cocooned in the canvas, he was completely hidden. "I love it," he said, poking his head out. Uncle Max passed him the sleeping bag and the pillow. "Not bad," he agreed, looking around with a satisfied smile. "Now then." He picked up Darkus's suitcase and placed it on top of the filing cabinets. "We should see about getting you some clothes." "I've got clothes." "Some new ones." Uncle Max smiled. "That jumper wouldn't look out of place on a tramp." "This is Dad's jumper," Darkus said quietly. "Oh." Uncle Max looked crestfallen. "Forgive me, Darkus. I'm an old fool." He cleared his throat. "Terribly insensitive of me." "Uncle Max?" Darkus swallowed. He couldn't look his uncle in the eye. "Now that you're back, the police they'll have to start looking for Dad again, won't they?" Uncle Max nodded. "I have an appointment with Scotland Yard tomorrow." "Tell them," Darkus leaned out of the hammock. "He wouldn't run away. He'd never leave me. Not with Mum gone. Something must have happened to him in that vault. Something bad." "Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to tell them." Uncle Max looked up with an apologetic grimace. "Darkus." He paused. "I'm truly sorry it took me so long to get back to you." He put his hat back on his head. "I feel terrible about it, and I will do my level best to find out what's happened to your father and bring him home. But if, as I suspect, the police aren't going to be very helpful, we may have to be doing a bit of investigating on our own, and that will require grit and determination from both of us." "You can count on me," Darkus said earnestly. "I knew I could." Uncle Max smiled. "Dinner's at 7. He stepped out of the room and saluted. "And it'll be fish and chips." Darkus listened to his uncle go downstairs. Then he leant back and pulled his suitcase up onto his lap. Opening it, he swept his clothes aside and took out a framed photograph of his father. Looking down at Dad's sandy hair and smiling blue eyes, he felt his chest tighten and his stomach twist. He stroked the glass. He missed his dad so much it hurt like a stitch in his chest. Darkus lay back in the hammock and propped the picture on the pillow beside him. Gazing up through the skylight, he watched the first stars appear. Tracing the constellations his father had taught him to recognise, he wondered if somewhere under this night sky his father was looking up and thinking of him. That's the end of chapter 1. I might be back to read a little bit more. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're all well and keeping safe. Make sure you keep up all the good work and keep sharing it with us all on Twitter. Stay safe, everybody. Bye.